Thanks, everyone for joining. Thanks, Rajita, for reaching out to me for this opportunity to be able to talk about my research work. I am Pallavi Goswami. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the School of Earth, Atmosphere and Environment at Monash University. And today I'm going to be talking about data-driven techniques for modeling drought. Rajita did give an introduction to what I do, but I just thought I'll give a brief overview of what my research entails. So I'm a drought scientist, and my drought interests have been particularly focused on understanding how here in Australia we have droughts onset, what drives them, what are their impacts, and how climate change is affecting them or causing their regimes to shift. So I do this from understanding the water cycle and how the water availability is impacted by climate on aspects of meteorology, the agriculture part, which is the soil moisture, as well as stream flows. So looking at hydrological droughts as well. My research has mostly been centered around understanding how catchments respond to meteorological and climate variables, how stream flows change during droughts and what drives those changes, and how water availability is going to change with changes in climate. So these are a lot of questions, I know, but I try to use data-driven modeling, statistical modeling to answer some of these questions. And I know when I talk about data-driven modeling, that's a big umbrella, right? But what I'm trying to what I'll try to present in this talk today is just a few handful of techniques which I've used in my previous research to give a glimpse of how statistical models and broadly speaking, data-driven models can help answer some of the research questions in the realm of droughts. So the way I have structured this talk, I've divided it into three segments. The first one is about how we can use non-stationary statistical models to understand dependencies of droughts with large-scale climate drivers. The second segment is focused on the use of hidden Markov models, which helps us to identify different state variables, the state changes in a particular variable of interest, which in my case is stream flows, because I look a lot at stream flows and how they are changing. So the second segment is basically understanding how regime shifts takes place during droughts using hidden Markov models. The third segment is something to do with flash droughts, which are droughts that have a rapid onset. So I'll be demonstrating the application of random forest models, how we can use these predictive models to understand the drivers of flash droughts, and if we can also find explanatory variables to understand their impacts. So I'll begin with the first segment, which is how we can use non-stationary statistical models to understand the relationship of droughts and large-scale climate drivers. So the idea of non-stationarity is basically to see if a given variable changes with time. So this is also motivated by a lot of studies that was done on the Millennium Drought, which was an unprecedented drought that lasted for 13 odd years here in Southeast Australia. And the studies that were focused on Millennium Drought brought to light that catchments can behave in very complex ways. And there is inherent non-stationarity in the way the rainfall runoff relationship gets modified because of these meteorological droughts. So following from the research that existed that demonstrated that there was rainfall runoff relationship change, and there was non-stationarity because of what the climate and the preconditions existed. This motivated me to understand if low flows or drought flows are also having a signal of non-stationarity in their time series. And so I will be using the word low flows a lot here. Just wanted to highlight that low flows are basically drought flows. So low flows in my study are basically periods which are anomalously low with respect to their climatology. And so I did some non-stationary modeling around low flows to see if they are non-stationary at all. Following from the studies that I showed in the previous slide, there was this millennium drought that affected a large part of Southeast Australia. So I thought for my study, maybe I could look at the catchments that are in Southeast Australia to see if the stream flows are influenced by large-scale climate drivers. Also, a paper that came out in 2016 by Saft et al. Showed that there was rainfall runoff relationship, as I pointed in the previous slide. So this sort of gave an idea that maybe there is non-stationarity in low flows that we see, but there could be other drivers that could explain them. And so following from other studies that suggested that there are large-scale climate drivers such as the El Nino Southern Oscillation, the Indian Ocean Dipole Moment, which affect the amount of rainfall that Southeast Australia receives, I thought maybe I could do like a stationary, non-stationary modeling with these climate drivers and the drought flows that are being observed in Southeast Australia. So yes, so that's basically the sense of the statistical models that I'll be discussing ahead. So the three main climate drivers that I identified for this research was the El Nino Southern Oscillation, the Indian Ocean Dipole, and the Southern Annular Mode. So these are basically the three large-scale modes of variability that impact the availability of water in our streams. So the idea is to understand if the ENSO, IOD, and SAM have a non-stationary relationship with the drought flows, and what exactly explains what the variability that we see in low flows or drought flows, and how does this change with time. So for these, I looked at 165, 161, 162, can't remember, but yeah, around 160 catchments in Southeast Australia. And these catchments were unimpaired, which means that there was not any anthropogenic influence on them. There was not there were no significant abstractions from them, so as to say that these the flows, the time series of flows that we had was strictly dictated by the climate and not anthropogenic modulation. So with these catchments, the first thing that I did was to identify the low flow periods. And so the stream flow data that we have for a lot of catchments in Southeast Australia, they are pretty skewed. So the first step that I did was I applied a Box-Cox transformation to the data. So what the Box-Cox transformation does is that it helps improve the representation of low values by giving them a higher weight, which helps us to arrive at the next step, which is standardizing the data. So if you have flows which are generally on the lower side, the Box-Cox transformation kind of helps to spread it out so that when you standardize it, it is the variability of it is pretty much representative of how a standardized distribution should look. So yes, so with the raw streamflow data, applying the Box-Cox transformation and then using the output to get a standardized streamflow drought index. And what that helps us do is with the standardized index, you can see how it jumps on either side of zero. So if it goes above zero, it represents anomaly of a certain fashion. If it goes below zero, it's anomaly on the other hand. And so what we can generally do with that is we can identify outliers or the extreme values. So the other thing that I did with this was I reversed the sign of the values. So just to indicate that positive values would represent droughts for easing explanation of the values that we see, because we don't want to deal with negative values and fit a distribution to that. So what you see over here is the standardized drought index that I obtained. And then the next step is to choose a threshold. So a very common terminology that comes very much widely used in extreme value analysis is something called POT, which is peak over threshold. What it does is when you've got extreme values to analyze, you choose a threshold and then you pick up the values that are above those thresholds to model. I've increased the resolution just to help you see what the events look like. So this is an event. Whenever my index goes above this threshold, there is a drought. And then the highest value that the index would take is the intensity of that event. And if I count the number of months for which this index remains above the threshold, that's the duration of that event. And then I count the number of such events happening per year. So that's the frequency of these events. So I've got three characteristics: the intensity, duration, and frequency. And I'm trying to model these using the large-scale climate drivers. So intensity is an extreme value. So I'm trying to fit an extreme value distribution. And because I said that I'm trying to do a non-stationary modeling, the parameter of the distribution would not be a constant value. Instead, it would be a variable. It would be a function of the climate index that I'm using. So that's the sense of the non-stationary modeling. So you allow the parameters of the distribution to change with time. And time is sort of intrinsic in the climate index because the climate index would be a time series. So the climate index would take different values with time, which overall would cause the distribution to have different values, the distribution to have a different behavior at different point of time. So that's how the intensity is modeled. And then coming to duration and annual frequency. So the catch over here is that duration and annual frequency, although they are representing an extreme event, which is drought, but they by themselves are not extreme values. And so there's a slightly different approach of how I've modeled duration and annual frequency. So instead of fitting an extreme value distribution, I've used a generalized linear model. And generalized linear models are also allowing us the flexibility where we can model them using time or using time-dependent variable, which in our case is the climate index. So that's how the three characteristics are modeled. And then we use a criteria, which is the Akai key information criteria, to understand the model's performance. So we've got heaps of models, which I'm going to show in the next slide. And then the AIC helps me to select the best model. But even after arriving at AIC, I don't know how much better is, let's say, my non-stationary model over my stationary model. So to have a sufficient amount of confidence in my non-stationary model, I compute another quantity, which I call the evidence ratio. So this evidence ratio is basically a weight of the non-stationary model and the stationary model in terms of its AIC value. But this really helps us to understand the significance of non-stationarity of a particular streamflow time series. So I've got heaps of models using different extreme value distributions for intensity, trying different all permutation and combinations of how the parameters could vary. So I've got NINO 3.4 index, which is the indicator for ENSO. I've got DMI, which is the dipole moment index, which is the index for the Indian Ocean dipole. Then I've got SAM, which is the index for the Southern annular mode. And so as you can see, I've tried all possible combinations of these drivers. I've put them individually. I've put them as combinations of two or also as combination of threes, because I'm assuming that I don't know anything a priori. And so I build up all models and then see which one is giving me the lowest AIC. So that's the rationale for intensity, and then similar goes for duration. I've picked different distributions depending on existing literature, what generally is used to fit distribution data, and also what is generally used for fitting frequency distributions, frequency data. So chosen those distributions accordingly. And then again, like I showed in the previous slide, all possible combinations in terms of how the parameters of the distribution could be varying. The table on the right is sort of giving an idea of which distribution was generally working well for the intensity, duration, and frequency, because there are a lot of catchments, and we can't assume that all catchments data would be explained by one particular distribution. So that's kind of the reason why we had brought in a lot of different distributions. So the idea is to pick up the best model and not to stick with one distribution or one model and apply it uniformly to all catchments. So this is basically an overall summary of what I've been describing of the different steps. So we've got the data, we've got the intensity model, we've got the duration model, we've got the annual frequency model, and then we use the evidence ratio to understand which non-stationary model is performing significantly better. And then what we do with that. So the next step is to understand if there is at all a relationship between the climate drivers and the low flows. And so even the climate drivers themselves, as you would know, have different phases. So they have a wet phase, they have a dry phase. And so what this framework really helps us to do is to be able to sort of tease out the nuances of how different phases influence stream flows. And so you can do this for the present historic data. You can do it for future data if you've got future data. So that's sort of the kind of idea that I had with building these models, because I wanted to see how the different phases affect low flow characteristics and how these climate drivers would be influencing stream flows in future. So here are the results from the different models that we've developed. The figure on the left is basically showing all the catchments which are non-stationary and the catchments which are stationary. So the ones that are hollowed, which do not have a color, are basically the catchments where we've got the stationary model as performing better compared to the non-stationary model. And the figure on the right is basically showing the evidence ratio. So like I said, evidence ratio is the evidence of the strength of non-stationarity that we have of the non-stationary model with respect to the stationary model. So we want a higher evidence ratio to be really sure that there is a strong link of the different phases of the climate drivers with the drought flows that are being observed. So that's for the intensity. And then I've got the results, similar results for duration, and then similar results for annual frequency. But yeah, just to highlight here that with annual frequency, we had many catchments that had significantly high evidence ratio. So what this means is that frequency is influenced a lot by the large-scale climate drivers. So there are a lot of other things that we could do once we have these stationary and non-stationary models. Like, for example, here I show in the case of intensity, you can see how many catchments were stationary, how many catchments were non-stationary. And even if a catchment is non-stationary, what are the dominant climate drivers that explain the drought flows when these climate drivers are active? And you could also sort of then use that information to see if in your region, is IOD dominating more, or is ENSO influencing more the drought flows that are being observed? So those are the kind of things that you can use further to infer from these models. For duration, we found that mostly duration is stationary. So the hydrological droughts duration have not changed a lot, and they don't change with respect to climate drivers. So let's say if there's a dry phase of ENSO, it's less likely to influence the duration of drought that we see. For frequency, like I said, the results were really interesting because there were more non-stationary models compared to stationary models. And also the interesting thing that we found was IOD was significantly influencing the drought flows that we had modeled, which means for the Southeast Australian catchments, the IOD has a direct link with the low flows that we see. Yeah, so those are the kind of things that we can do with these models, and we can play around with the historic data to see how that's changing. So for example, over here I've got different phases. So I've got a dry phase, wet phase of ENSO, and I've seen how the probability distribution is changing. So obviously, because I'm modeling drought flows, so you would expect the dry phase of ENSO or the dry phase of the IOD and the dry phase of SAM to be responsible for higher intensities. So you can see like the brown curve is slightly shifted towards the right, which means higher intensity associated with those phases. So that's for intensity. Again, for duration, we saw that shift. So the brown curve is slightly shifted towards the right, which means higher likelihood of observing longer duration hydrological droughts when the dry phase is active. And that's for frequency. So similar results for frequency. We've got, again, the same shift happening. So the dry phase is associated with higher annual frequency of hydrological droughts. So that was all with the historic data. Like I said, once those models are ready, we can do a lot of other stuff with them. We could also look at how the future phases of these climate drivers would be influencing the low flows. And so this is what I demonstrated with the observed data. But what we can do is we can see if the future dry phase of these climate drivers are going to make these distributions shift further to the right, which means they're going to intensify or prolong these hydrological droughts. And this is also motivated by some studies that have shown that large-scale climate drivers like the El Nino and the Indian Ocean dipole movement are actually projected to intensify in future. So given that we do have this information that these drivers would intensify, are they also going to give rise to more intensified hydrological droughts? And the results showed, yes, they do, at least for Southeast Australia. We do have, again, the same shift in the distribution. As you can see, the projected one is the darker orange color. The present one is the beige, the yellow color. And as you can see, for intensity, we're again shifting towards the right, which means the future dry phases would be which would be leading to more intense hydrological droughts. More prolonged hydrological droughts. As you can see, the durations are much higher for the orange curve. And then also for frequency. The frequency also shows this dramatic shift towards higher values. So yeah, that's the wrap up on the first segment. So I hope you've got an idea of how we can use non-stationary modeling to understand links between time varying variables and to use them to do some projections to understand how those distributions might be changing. The second segment of this talk is about understanding if we can model regime shifts in droughts. So this was motivated by just eyeballing how the intensity looks like. So the same intensity data that I had from the previous study, I was trying to plot how the probability distribution changes for different spans of time. And interestingly, I observed that there were two modes to those distribution, as you can see from the figure on the right, which is basically like the 20-year window of intensity moving ahead in time. And so because there was this unique to bimodal behavior to this intensity distribution, that kind of gave me an idea that maybe there are two regimes. Most of the times the intensity is sampled from one half of the distribution, but then there are also times when we've got values coming from the second peak. So what this all hinted to is that maybe there are different states of intensities. And so then how do we model different states? So one such approach that has been used previously, especially a recent paper that came up in Science, had used hidden Markov models. And so hidden Markov models can actually help to identify if there are different states. And what do I mean by different states is basically if you've got a system, let's say in our case, we've got streamflows, under certain conditions or under certain climate forcings, the variable values could change drastically. And so the distribution that explains the value coming from state one doesn't explain the values that are coming from state two. So then the idea was to understand if the IDFs, the intensity, duration, and frequency that I was playing around earlier, do they have multiple states and can I model them? So then I use the hidden Markov models to explain if there are state changes. And then, of course, there are a lot of assumptions that go into it because we don't know any information a priori. We don't know how many states could there be. Could there be 2, 3 more, etc. So there are a bit of assumptions, and I guess that's always a caveat when you have to deal with data-driven models. You've got to make some assumptions, and then also, like the more complex you make a model, it's sort of giving you more information, but it's also coming at the expense of more parameters that you're adding to it. So it's again like a trade-off of what you want to do and what's the ease of getting around with these models. So just to keep things simple, I only assumed that there were 2 states. And so, like I said, I used hidden Markov models for understanding the different states of hydrological droughts. And so what are hidden Markov models? So hidden Markov models are basically distributions that generate observations based on an underlying process. So that underlying process follows the Markov property, which you can see over here. So C1, C2, C3, C4 are basically states. And then X1, X2, X3, X4 are the observations. So in this case, the observations are stream flows because I deal with stream flows. And then I'm assuming that there's this hidden state that determines the observed value. So I'm not going into the nitty-gritties of this, but then we've got to play around with some matrices. We've got an initial condition matrix. We've got transposing matrix. Yeah. So essentially, the idea is to have like a likelihood function, which is optimized to arrive at the different parameters to determine what's the number of states of a given observations time series. So because we know that there is non-stationarity, so using that from the previous study, I again had a bit of implicit non-stationarity in the parameters of these distributions again. And so this time I wasn't using the climate drivers like how I did in the previous study, but this study directly dealt with something called the standardized API. And API is antecedent precipitation index. So this is following from a very clear logic that precipitation conditions dictate the stream flows that we observe. So just to keep things simple, I just dealt with precipitation as a covariate here instead of the large-scale climate drivers. So yeah, again, the IDF models and then feeding into the hidden Markov models to understand the different possible states. So like I said, in my hidden Markov models, I assume that there can only be two states. There can be three possibilities. The first possibility is that the entire time series of the intensities of the hydrological drought is sampled from one single distribution. And so there's just one possible state, and we call this the normal state. The second possibility is that there could be two states. The first one is the normal intensity, and then the second one is a higher, more intensified state. And so what this means is if you have something like this, it means droughts sometimes can behave in a more intensified way. So you would observe stream flow values that have generally not been observed in previous droughts. And the third outcome could be that the second state, instead of being high, could be low. So that means that droughts are sort of becoming less intense because of some reasons. So you've got surplus water somewhere, you've got less water somewhere, depending on how the catchments are linked. So there is a possibility that some catchments could actually see droughts becoming less intense. And yes, we have not really looked into the physicality of it as what explains why the states would be changing. But then there are some literature that suggests that it's also got to do with how the groundwater gets disconnected with the base flows because of some hydrological disturbance. So just to keep things simple, but also giving an idea at the same time what is causing the state change is some hydrological disturbance. This is the result that I obtained by fitting the hidden Markov models. So the middle panel is basically the intensity of hydrological droughts over time. So every green dot that you see is basically a drought, and we're reporting what's the intensity of it. So what happens is things were pretty normal. The drought flows were as you would expect for a long time at this catchment until the millennium drought happened. And then we started observing much more intensified stream flows in terms of the anomalies. So the anomalies were much more dire compared to how they were for previous droughts. And so this is what the outcome of the hidden Markov model suggests, that there was a regime shift in the droughts. And so extremes became more extreme. So the pink dots that you see over here are basically the new intensified drought flows that you see. The green star that you see, which is on the same vertical, is basically what would have been observed if it was in the same state. So if it just had the same, if it just had one state, it would the values that we observe would have been much more less in terms of intensity. So this we felt this was like a really good result, because what it is trying to show is that droughts themselves have also undergone regime shifts. So we do have catchments which are showing flows that were not observed previously, and so there is unprecedented severity of streamflow droughts that are that happened during the Millennium Drought. And so this is just showing the whole picture of the catchments that we looked at. So I was trying to map where we have those catchments which have intensified. So the catchments that are in the coral pink color are basically the catchments where we have seen drought stream flows become more intensified than what they were historically. And interestingly, there were also some catchments, which you see in the blue color, which saw flows which were not as low as they used to be for previous droughts. This is again a big research gap, and we still need to address how catchments, might be behaving. But like I said, catchments can behave in very complex ways, and so there can be instances when some catchments would experience more severe droughts, whereas some would not experience as severe as many others. But what the hidden Markov models was able to achieve was that there can be two underlying distributions that explains the different observations of stream flows that we have for the droughts. And like I said, it's still a very open challenge for drought scientists like myself to understand what exactly is causing the different regimes to emerge. There are papers that suggest that meteorological droughts change the way hydrological droughts behave. And then there's also signals from the larger climate and the climate change narrative around it. But yes, like I said, this is still something which is very much work in progress. We need to understand what explains the different drought flows that we observe. But yes, what we were able to achieve with this is that there are, these shifts in droughts, and we need to be better prepared when there's this regime shift. So we need to be better prepared for the flows that we would expect, say, for example, as inflows to major reservoirs, because then the water availability can then be a factor that determines the economic losses or the other societal sectors that might be affected. So very quickly, I'll come to the last bit, which is the flash drought part. This is something that I've been doing recently in my postdoc. So flash droughts basically are droughts that have a very rapid rate of onset. So they start very quickly compared to the conventional idea of a drought, where the conventional idea says that it's a creeping phenomena that takes weeks and weeks and weeks to show signals on the ground. So flash droughts are sort of, they're not really a new type of drought, but they've been researched more often now these days. And so flash droughts basically is a whole different realm where we don't really know how different are they from conventional droughts in terms of the drivers, and what exactly causes them, what are the impacts, and how we can really predict those things. So with this work, I was trying to understand flash droughts, like I said. And flash droughts usually take days and weeks to onset. So that's a really small period of time over which we rapidly lose soil moisture. Studies say that there's an increased evaporative demand, which leads to these. So there's a potential role of vapor pressure deficit, or high winds, increased solar radiation, and all those stuff. So we've got a fair bit of idea of what can be causing these flash drought events, and so we pick from there to use random forest models to see if we can identify the predictors. But yes, the flash droughts definitely are important because, like I mentioned, they do affect a lot of important sectors. They affect agriculture, livestock, economy, and yeah, several other things that depend on them. But primarily, they've been understood as soil moisture droughts. So agriculture definitely is a big sector that gets affected when there is a flash drying happening. So what I did for this work was I was looking at soil moisture. So soil moisture represented in terms of the root zone, soil moisture percentiles. So how much water do we have in the top 100 centimeters of the soil, and how rapidly are we losing that? So I will talk in terms of percentiles because the percentiles give an idea of how we're doing with respect to the climatology. So the approach is pretty simple. We look at how the how the soil moisture percentiles change with time. We've got two thresholds here. So we've got the 40th percentile and we've got the 20th percentile. The 40th is indicating near normal conditions. The 20th percentile is drought conditions. So the idea is to understand how long does it take for us to go from here to here. And if that's relatively short compared to a conventional drought, then we say it's a flash drought. So really simple approach, just looking at how the soil moisture percentile goes from 40th to 20th. And like I said, existing literature has put out various conjectures of what could be possibly driving these. And so here in Australia, the attempt was to understand if we can pin it to certain meteorological variables that might be causing these flash droughts. So for this study, I was looking at 4 catchments. As you can see, the Richmond River catchment in the east, the Murrumbidgee River catchment, the Swan Coast and Avon River catchment in the southwest, and then there's one catchment in the north, the Daly River catchment. And so the idea was to have catchments which also are coming from a different part of the country, so representing a different hydroclimate, just to make sure that we are catering to all possible predictors possible that explains this rapid depletion in soil moisture. And so this was done using, like I said, random forest model. And so just a little bit background about random forest models. They are sort of a decision tree, but like an ensemble of decision trees. So imagine, you've got your predictors and you've got your predictants, and then you've got a decision tree based on certain conditions. You arrive at a final output, but then you do bagging and boosting so that you've got a more comprehensive picture of what are the different possibilities that can come out of all these decision trees, and then use some aggregating method to get to your final result. So that is what random forests are in a nutshell, so to speak. So with this particular work, we were trying, like I said, trying to see if the root zone soil moisture can be explained by meteorological variables. So we looked at precipitation, maximum temperature, the actual evapotranspiration, potential evapotranspiration, minimum temperature, average temperature, and vapor pressure deficit. So just listing out the steps that we followed for this. With all these data, the predictors and the predictants, we fit in a random forest model. So the approach is something that I discussed earlier. So we've got this basically magnitude of the difference that we see, and then the same at the same time, what's the anomaly that's represented by these meteorological variables. So the thing with random forest model is it gives you something that's called a predictor importance. So predictor importance is basically it's a value that tells you how much important a particular predictor is. So because we've got so many predictors, the predictor importance tells us which variable is relatively more important compared to others. So the results were pretty mixed, as you would expect, because, like I said, the 4 catchments are coming from different hydroclimatic regions. And so what explains the driver at one particular catchment might not explain what's happening at the other catchment. But what was interesting was there was a significantly important role played by potential evapotranspiration and VPD. So as you can see over here in this figure, we've got like really higher value of PET compared to other climate drivers for the Richmond River catchment, which is on the East Coast. And also because there are sort of similar variables that go in defining VPD as well as PET, there was a similar peak that was observed for VPD. However, I also note that for other catchments, VPD was not as strong a player. But like I said, there can be a possibility that different variables would be explaining the flash drying in different regions. However, I would just want to flag a caveat here because this is data-driven modeling. Oftentimes, it's sort of difficult to really validate these kind of results. So for example, if we do have, for example, PET playing an important role in one catchment, it might be really challenging to sort of look at the influence in terms of the time series. But yeah, I guess that's just something that's to be taken with a pinch of salt when you are dealing with data-driven models. But yeah, so what I think is a good way to deal with that kind of a problem is you can then pool a lot of similar catchments and then see if the results sort of match. But yeah, that was like a glimpse of how we can use random forest models to do some predictive modeling. And the last part was which I was trying to work out with these random forest model was to see if I can also model the impact of flash droughts. So flash droughts can have an influence on the hydrological systems. And as you would have already guessed, that I really like playing with streamflow data. So I was trying to see if I can model the streamflow losses that we observe during flash droughts using the random forest model. And so for this particular study, I was looking at flash droughts happening in several different catchments spread across Australia. These were unimpaired perennial catchments, and then identifying streamflow flash droughts using the same approach that I discussed earlier. So streamflow percentiles going from 40th to 20th in a very short period of time. And this is just to give a glimpse of, how does the frequency of these events look like? How does the onset duration of these events look like? What's the total duration of these flash drought events? And what's the seasonality of it? So these events definitely are significant because we see two events per decade. So that's less because these are rare events, but still critical. And then the onset duration on an average is 10 days, which is very alarming because that means that you can lose a significant amount of water when these events happen. And then when these events do happen, they last for around 2 to 3 months, which can be pretty significant if, let's say, the stream flows were feeding into reservoirs or doing important ecosystem services downstreams. And then most of them were observed during the austral summer and autumn. So similar to the approach that I showed earlier, I had a bunch of different predictors, and then I was trying to see if I can model the percentage reduction in stream flows during onset. On the figure, which is on the left, I was trying to see what is in general the losses that happen when these events happen. And as you can see, the median is very close to 60%. Which shows that there is a significant reduction in stream flows. The other thing with these predictors was I bifurcated them into two, the physical attributes of the catchments and then the climate attributes of the catchments, just to see if the physical characteristics sort of have a more important role to play compared to the climate characteristics or vice versa. So the figure on the left is basically the results from fitting the random forest model. What we find over here is that the physical characteristics don't play that significant a role compared to the climate characteristics. And even within the climate characteristics, the dryness index as well as the annual PET have a much higher role to play. So if I put all those losses into this diagram, which is called the Budico framework, where I basically have the evaporative index mapped against the dryness index, I do see that the the catchments which have higher percentage reduction in stream flows are coming from more water limited regions or regions with higher dryness index. So just illustrating that that's also an application of how you can use those random forest models to come up with inferences of the climate characteristics that could be determining the losses that you see and not just do predictive modeling. So I guess that's a wrap up from my side. And I think I might have gone a bit overboard with time. But just this last slide to conclude that what I was trying to do with this presentation is to show that, first demonstrating how non-stationary statistical models can be used to link drought flows with large-scale climate drivers, and then use those models to understand how the relationships are changing with time. The second one was when I'm using hidden Markov models to understand state flow shifts. And so demonstrating that you can model shifts in distributions using hidden Markov models. And the last one was application of random forest models to do some predictive modeling to come up with identification of drivers of flash droughts, as well as to come up with explanations of what causes the impacts of during these flash droughts. I guess I'll just wrap it up there. Yeah, happy to take questions.